It's a great question, Matt, and Canada is trying to figure out the answer. One of the things we need to understand about tariffs, however, is that they're not just an economic weapon.
America is facing a threat that few expected, not from the east, not from the west, but right from our neighbor. Canada, our closest ally, who has always been a loyal and quiet neighbor, has now declared economic war. This is not just a trade dispute or a reaction to tariffs. It is a war in which the stakes are so high that every day brings new threats and consequences.
Well, it looks like it is. In fact, of course, if you look back at what the US has been doing for quite some time, they have been becoming more and more protectionist, and in different presidents as well. So it's not just Trump, although now it has accelerated.
On August 1st, 2025, relations between the two countries began to crack when Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing 35% tariffs on goods from Canada. But here's what's shocking: Canada isn't just responding with blows. They're not taking up the challenge in the traditional sense. No, they've decided to strike at the most vulnerable spot, the US economy and even entire states. There's nothing random about this. The Canadian government isn't just strengthening its defenses, it's ready for a full-blown economic attack.
We've always been very pro-Canadian, even way before all this stuff happened. This just reinforced it.
Just imagine $2.8 billion worth of goods are stuck at the border, and factories in Michigan and New York could shut down in just a few days. Canada isn't just raising tariffs, it's finding ways to use its geographical position to its advantage. What makes this even more dangerous? It's hard to believe, but if the situation doesn't change, one of the US states could face complete economic destruction.
It would have been small and on the back. Once they realized that they were getting a bad rap, they went ahead and they added Made in Canada labels permanently onto the bags.
In August, Canada took emergency measures that will allow it to impose high tariffs on all US goods, and that's not all. British Columbia has passed a law allowing restrictions on trucks from the US, and there is also an idea to make environmental additives mandatory for all American vehicles traveling to Alaska. Alaska has essentially become a hostage to its isolation. The only way to reach the state is through Canada. Blocking this route would mean economic disaster for the entire region.
And actually, the response on the markets has not been as severe as many people had predicted. After the initial kind of, calamitous falls of the stock markets and the rise in the bond markets, things seem to have calmed down, and now the stock market in the US certainly is booming.
The situation is further exacerbated by the fact that Canada is going even further. Its response to US sanctions is not just a reaction to trade tariffs. Canada is beginning to strike precisely and selectively at key sectors of the American economy. Trade restrictions, bans on certain American products, and the removal of brands from stores every step is strategically calculated. But what is even more dangerous is the creation of a special economic war cabinet that has already developed more than 60 scenarios for retaliatory measures aimed at destroying the most vulnerable US supply chains. And many of these plans do not just affect Trump's allies, but could hit entire sectors of the economy.
And you hear it anecdotally, either Canadians staying in Canada for vacation or going to somewhere else like Europe.
This is not just a deterioration in relations. It is a demonstration of how peaceful relations can be turned into a geopolitical disaster. But what will happen next? How far is Canada prepared to go in this trade war? And most importantly, what consequences will this have for the US, which has always considered Canada an integral part of its global alliance?
Well, yes, I don't think the deal is particularly good for the EU. I mean, they've ended up having now tariffs which are considerably higher than was the case before. So if you look at the average, about 15%, it was 2% or 2.5%. The tariffs that existed before in terms of EU exports into the US. So they certainly have ended up in a worse position with a lot of uncertainty.
On August 1st, 2025, the world was shocked by the news that US President Donald Trump had decided to impose 35% tariffs on all goods imported from Canada. This measure was a response to accusations that the Canadian authorities were not doing enough to prevent fentanyl from entering the US. Trump claimed that it was time for Canada to do more to combat drug trafficking, and without hesitation, dealt a blow to the economy of its closest neighbor. However, no one could have imagined the consequences these tariffs would have. Instead of simply responding with mirror measures, the Canadian authorities decided to take a radical step that shook the entire economic world.
So we're in our wine section now. Our wine business, roughly 35–40% of our red wine sales is California cabs. and blends. So that's $60,000 a week in sales that are just gone. They've evaporated from the United States. We're replacing it, and we're replacing it with import wines from France, from South Africa, from Australia, from New Zealand.
From the outset, it seemed that by taking such a measure, the US was simply creating difficulties for its economic partner. But in fact, this was only the first phase of a larger game. While US officials sincerely believed that Canada would simply introduce retaliatory tariffs and the situation would soon calm down, a completely different plan was already being developed in Canada. With their actions, the US has awakened a real economic hyena, and now they may not be ready for the consequences. This is not just a trade conflict, it is almost an economic war. Canadian analysts have begun to calculate how many goods cross the border every day and every month, and how much the US depends on the stability of this flow. According to the most rough estimates, in 2025, goods worth about $1.3 trillion will pass through the Canadian-US border annually, and every day that's tens of billions of dollars.
With Trump, he did quite a lot in his first term, and he's doing a lot more now, and that's a real problem for everybody. And indeed, if you look at growth forecasts, generally they're being downgraded overall because of this, except the last IMF forecast, International Monetary Fund, which came out just before the latest tariffs were announced, had actually done a little upgrade.
But it would seem that the most ordinary goods, oil, auto parts, grain, cheese, food products, became the very cards that Canada was ready to use to play a strategic game against the US. Trump imposed tariffs without expecting Canada to choose such a tough tactic. It soon became clear that Canada would not need to respond directly, but simply slow down the movement of goods across the border. From the outset, Canada announced that American goods would face new challenges: extensive customs checks, additional documentation, and queues. Deliveries began to be delayed by weeks. In 2025, according to Canadian sources, in the first 3 weeks after the tariffs were introduced, trade with the US fell by 20%, which was the first warning sign for American businessmen.
The most in demand and the hardest ones to replace from the US is typically berries, citrus, and greens, lettuce.
If there is produce from the US and produce from Canada, and they're the same, of course, I'll go Canadian, of course.
Factories in Michigan and New York began to lose huge numbers of orders, and jobs were on the verge of being cut. It seemed only a matter of time before the US economy would feel the full brunt of what was happening. But, as it turned out, Canada had no intention of stopping at economic pressure alone. More aggressive measures were soon taken. The Canadian government began discussing the possibility of halting all oil supplies to the US. After all, about 20% of American oil demand comes from Canada. But hitting the energy sector was too dangerous, and Canadian ministers decided to focus on a softer but very painful attack: trade corridors, which were becoming increasingly key to the ongoing struggle.
Which still hasn't quite been decided. Conflicting information coming from the US and the EU as to where we have landed on that, and there could be higher rates at some point. Steel and aluminium, not quite sorted out, because the requirement is also that one doesn't use imports of material, if you like, from China to be exempt, etc., etc.
This led to an even more unpredictable move. British Columbia passed a law allowing huge tolls to be levied on all American trucks crossing the border into Alaska. This was a real blow below the belt for the US. Finding itself in a vulnerable position, the state of Alaska was one of the most affected by the economic consequences. After all, the only road connecting Alaska to the rest of the US runs through Canada. Immediately after the law was introduced in Alaska, the first border checks began, and it soon became clear that every truck crossing the border had to pay additional fines. Moreover, if all the requirements were not met, the cargo would simply not be allowed to pass. At first glance, these measures seemed unusual and even absurd, but in reality, they put enormous pressure on Alaska's economy. Faced with this, local authorities were forced to postpone many infrastructure projects, and businesses began to lose millions of dollars due to long delays at the border.
How is that affecting kind of these perceived American products like Coca-Cola or Lay's?
Yeah, Coca-Cola and Lay's are great examples of global brands. They actually bottle Coke bottles in Canada, about an hour and 30 minutes north of here. Frito-Lay uses Canadian potatoes. There would have been no identification of where Frito-Lay products were made.
For the US, this was the first warning sign. Alaska, which had been relatively calm about these issues until then, found itself at the epicenter of an economic blockade organized by Canada. But the Canadians did not stop there. Following the roadblocks and the introduction of additional tariffs, they began to increase pressure on other regions, making it clear that the country was ready for any form of economic struggle. With this move, Canada effectively closed a strategic corridor for the US and showed how easily it could hold the American economy by the throat. And it all started with what seemed like a simple trade dispute, which turned into a real economic siege. It is now clear that the US did not expect such a powerful and coordinated counter-reaction from Canada. Instead of responding with standard measures, Canada has built a whole strategy to isolate and economically squeeze the US. By taking such a radical step, it has put the country in an unstable position that only foreshadows new, even more destructive events in global trade. As the conflict developed, Canada decided not to stop at blocking supplies and tariffs. It began to move toward more strategic and calculated actions, demonstrating that its response was much more thought than it initially appeared. In response to economic pressure from the US, Canada organized countermeasures that threatened not only trade relations between the countries, but also the entire economic stability of the North American region. One of the most serious steps was the threat to use Canada's geographical position as economic leverage. An example of this was the British Columbia government's decision to introduce emergency legislation that would allow huge tolls to be levied on American commercial trucks crossing Canadian territory on their way to Alaska. This move came as a surprise to the US, as Alaska is the only state that is essentially geographically cut off from the rest of the country, and the only way to get there is through Canada. For the US, this meant catastrophic consequences, as such a blockade would leave them unable to quickly and efficiently deliver goods to the region. Alaska was an economically vulnerable state, and such a measure would have dealt a crushing blow to the local economy. However, Canada went even further. It soon became known that the provincial government was considering imposing additional fines on American trucks if they did not use fuel with Canadian additives. For companies operating on this route, this could have resulted in huge losses and additional bureaucratic burdens. Delays, fines, and the need to pay for environmental additives could have led to the economic isolation of Alaska and a slowdown in its growth. But that was only the beginning. Canada realized that the US was not expecting such a level of retaliation and decided to keep up the pressure. Soon, in response to Trump's actions, new economic sanctions were imposed on a number of states that supported the president. For example, New Brunswick passed a law banning the sale of American products in provincial stores. Alcohol, meat, and food are just a small part of what disappeared from the shelves of local supermarkets. This measure had an impact on the US economy and on business in Canada. However, such actions were not limited to goods. In Manitoba, for example, a ban was imposed on American companies participating in government tenders. It was expected that this would deprive American corporations of contracts for the construction of large facilities and infrastructure projects in Canada, which would deal a significant blow to the sector. But the most serious threat came from British Columbia, where the authorities announced that they would impose high tariffs on all goods from the US if they were transported through Canadian territory. This, combined with environmental safety requirements, could have jeopardized all deliveries to the country. It was becoming clear that Canada was not just responding with countermeasures, but was developing a whole strategy aimed at weakening the US. They began to target key sectors of the economy. The Canadian government studied the vulnerabilities of the American economy, identifying weak points in supply chains and trade. This process was not accidental. It was carried out with maximum precision to hit regions that actively supported Trump and his policies. For example, in New Brunswick, the law banning the sale of American alcohol indirectly hit popular brands, especially those produced in red states. This was a clear political move aimed at disrupting the US's internal economic ties by targeting those who actively supported the president. An equally important step was the Canadian government's work to create the so-called Trade and Economic Security Council. This was a high-level and analytical body created to identify US economic vulnerabilities and prepare countermeasures. Within a couple of months of this body's work, leaks emerged that Canada had prepared more than 60 different scenarios for countermeasures to US trade sanctions. These included attacks on agriculture, the aviation industry, and defense contracts. For example, if the trade war continued, Canada was prepared to restrict supplies of agricultural products on which the US agricultural industry was heavily dependent. Moreover, against a backdrop of strong political tensions, Canadian sources began to claim that the country was planning active cooperation with other global partners to weaken its dependence on trade with the US. And while the US had previously been its largest trading partner, Canada was now looking for other avenues for economic growth, particularly through Europe and Asia. Canada's actions could not fail to affect US industry. Companies that had counted on stable Canadian supplies now faced sharp price fluctuations and delays at the border. And while there had previously been confidence that the US could always count on its neighbor, it was now clear that this confidence had been a naive mistake. Canada turned its territory into a battlefield for geopolitical battles, and the US was among the losers. Canada wasn't just playing an economic game, it showed how the economy can be used as a tool to pressure and influence an entire country, becoming a true master of economic diplomacy. Canada's response to US trade aggression was perhaps the most decisive step that a neighboring state could have taken. From the outset, the US underestimated the capabilities of its northern border and did not expect Canada to be so inventive in its response. The US soon realized that the game with Canada was not just a momentary conflict, but a strategic move that could last for years, changing the dynamics of global trade and politics. After Canada began to implement its economic countermeasures, the situation quickly moved into a new phase. Now that the US found itself in a geopolitical impasse, Canada continued its economic attacks with even greater precision and severity. The Trade and Economic Security Council system created by Canada became not just a defensive tool, but a veritable economic war cabinet capable of strategically and meticulously attacking the most vulnerable parts of the US economy. This body analyzed and developed hundreds of options for economic impact, and it was ultimately their combination that led to a further escalation of the conflict. Aware of the vulnerability of its economy, Canada created a special team to find and attack the US's weak spots in supply chains and trade flows. And as is often the case in modern geopolitical games, economic warfare turned out to be not just a metaphor for trade, but a real weapon that could be used against every key sector of the American economy. The Canadian Economic Headquarters focused on such strategically important areas as agriculture, energy, and aviation. American farmers, who had previously felt protected in the market, now began to lose huge supplies to Canada, and that was only the beginning. It was precisely these areas of the economy that became the most important targets in Canada's retaliatory measures. By early September of that year, it was clear that Canada had developed more than 60 different scenarios for influencing the US economy, most of which involved short and long-term blows that could ruin major American corporations. Canada's response to Trump's aggressive foreign policy and trade strategy deserves special mention. Canadian officials and economists began to actively engage in international negotiations with Europe and Asia, seeking new opportunities to diversify their trade flows. This led the country to actively improve its infrastructure, improving trade routes with the European Union and Asian countries. This was an unexpected move, as Canada was not simply closing its doors to the US, but also opening up new prospects for development on the global stage. This strategic shift in relations with other regions of the world quickly began to have an impact on global markets. Canadian companies, especially in the high-tech and raw materials sectors, found new opportunities to expand their presence in Asia, which provided an additional economic boost. At the same time, Canada began to implement tougher measures on trade with the US, which affected a number of key industries, primarily aviation. The cancellation of some aviation supplies and contracts, as well as the refusal to sign new agreements with American aircraft manufacturers, left a significant number of large American companies in a difficult position. Canada used every element of its strategy to create maximum difficulties for American companies, thereby shifting the economic balance on the continent. American corporations accustomed to doing business with Canada without any problems were thrown into confusion. Large agricultural companies and technology giants found that their usual supplies were no longer arriving or were subject to huge delays due to increased duties and environmental checks. In this context, the Canadian side used territorial and political leverage to penetrate the deepest aspects of trade chains. The response against US industry has been extremely harsh. The Canadian authorities have imposed sanctions on entire sectors, such as pharmaceuticals and automotive. All these measures are aimed not only at disrupting existing contracts, but also at setting a precedent for future trade wars. On the other hand, it is clear that work has begun in Canada itself to diversify and strengthen the domestic market. While the US was plunging into trade isolation, Canada realized that now was the best time to support domestic industries and open up new horizons for its population. Canadian leaders began to consider the possibility of creating new economic alliances and blocs with other countries in order not to depend on America, which had become embroiled in its own trade war. In addition, Canadian officials began to work more actively with local economic communities, including labor and farmers' unions, to prepare the country for a possible prolonged economic crisis. One of the most striking and visible measures in response to everything that was happening was the development of transport infrastructure and an increase in exports to China and other countries in the East. Canadian companies, with some help from the government, started looking for new ways to ship their products, expanding the use of seaports and air transport, which gradually reduced their long-term dependence on the US as a trading partner. Canadian companies began to view China as a market with enormous potential. Instead of limiting itself to the US, Canada focused on long-term investments in the future, which allowed it to minimize the damage caused by American isolation.